as we were just discussing with the Health Secretary, from tomorrow, all arrivals at the UK borders will, with a few exceptions, have to quarantine for 14 days, with the government arguing those measures are necessary to avoid another spike in coronavirus infections. Concerns have been raised, though, about the damage that this could do to airlines and the economy, and the science behind the move too. Well, to discuss that and more, we're joined by the Shadow Transport Secretary, Jim McMahon. Thank you for being on the programme this morning. Keen to get onto the quarantine, but I just wanted to start with the anti-racism protests that we've seen hitting the United Kingdom. Thousands of people taking part yesterday. The vast majority of it was peaceful, but there were a few violent scenes. Do you condemn those?
Well, I think, first of all, we fully understand the emotional outcry at seeing what's going on in America. And, of course, people feel passionately about that. People want to show solidarity. And also people want to make sure that in the UK, we get our own house in order too, in terms of those underlying inequalities that still exist in many places. And so, of course, people want to be able to demonstrate and show their voice and solidarity in that. And it's important to say that, I mean, of course, you know, some of the scenes that we're seeing are not acceptable in terms of missiles being thrown, but they will be a tiny handful of the people that were there to show solidarity and show peace together.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Of course, no one would disagree with that. I was just talking to the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock. He said although he has a lot of sympathy with the protests, he doesn't believe the UK is a racist society. Do you think it is?
I think there are definitely pockets of very deep-rooted racism in this country. I wouldn't say it's the majority, but where it exists, it's very deep. And, you know, whether that's physically in some communities, whether that's online in the way that many of our online platforms just don't do anywhere near enough to police that effectively, it's unavoidable to say that racism exists. And in many places, it's been allowed to go on unchecked. And so we do need to face up to that, because if we don't face up to it, we can't put the measures in place to deal with it.
It feels like a time when people are doing a lot of reflecting, a lot of soul searching on, you know, what we can do in our own lives to try and tackle those structural inequalities that we see. Labour, of course, has never elected a leader who isn't white. What do you think that Labour could do to try and help the anti-racist cause? And are there any things that you in particular are, you know, reflecting on in your own life?
Well, I think from a Labour perspective, we are an open and inclusive party. And if you look at our shadow cabinet, you know, we've got 7 members from BAME communities on the shadow cabinet. You know, the Shadow Lord Chancellor is black himself. And I do think as though it's more of a collective effort that I see, really, which is that we all need to take personal and collective responsibility for making sure that we call out injustice and racism where we see it, but also that we take a more concerted action to address the kind of the inbuilt inequalities that we see. Because for far too many people, you know, the place where you were born, your life conditions on the day that you were born, will determine your whole life experience through school, through the workplace, in terms of how long you're going to live. Are you going to live 10 years less than a counterpart in a different postcode? You know, there's some really deep-rooted inequalities in this country that we've been very, very slow to address. And even if you go back to 2017 and Theresa May's race disparity audit, you know, very little action, in my view, has been taken on actually cementing some of the recommendations in that, and we need to do far more.
Now, more than 40,000 people have died of COVID-19 in the United Kingdom, and a disproportionate number of those deaths were from people from black and minority ethnic backgrounds. In a time when we're socially distancing, do you think it's right that so many people took to the streets in crowds, gathering in large groups yesterday?
I think, first of all, we need to dispel some idea that the UK has been in a bubble and all of a sudden these group of people who are demonstrating have come out of that in a way that is not representative of the country at large. I've got to tell you, from my own casework here in Oldham, you know, there are thousands of people in Oldham, there'll be hundreds of thousands of people around the country who have been going to work where social distancing hasn't been maintained because
it's quite a specific question, though. It is quite
themselves and families.
I'm sorry
safe.
to come in
So
because I feel like you're answering a slightly different question. Do you think it is right that at a time when, you know, hundreds of people are still being announced as dying from coronavirus every day, do you think it's right that people took to the streets in the way they did, specifically on that?
No, I'm very clear that we are really fearful that we're going to get a second spike in the virus. We are not out of the woods at all. Hundreds of people are still dying every day in this country, and we all need to play our part individually and collectively to make sure that we don't risk that. My point was more that there are people who are forced to break social distancing every day going through work and carrying out their everyday lives. I can just say in terms of Equita, MPs were in Parliament lining up, often breaking social distancing because of the pinch point in terms of upholding our democratic responsibility. We also need to understand that peaceful assembly is also a very important part of our democratic process as well. And so, of course, we don't want anybody to break social distancing. We want to make sure that we control the virus, but we also need to put it into perspective as well.
OK. Now, just to move on to your transport brief, the UK is bringing in a 14-day quarantine for anyone arriving in the country from tomorrow. We discussed it already in the programme. Is it something you welcome, and do you think people should be booking a summer holiday abroad?
Our real concern is that the government just haven't got a plan. They seem to go from one extreme to another, so going from absolutely no restrictions, up until only a couple of days ago, we were the outlier in terms of the world with having either no full restrictions in place or no partial restrictions in place, up there with Serbia and Mexico. And now we go to a very blunt tool. It's a 14-day quarantine when 22 million people have come into this country since the new year. Even since the lockdown began, 10 to 15,000 people have been coming into the country. And so we do need to make sure that whatever we do in terms of interventions, that it's evidence-based, there's a proper plan in place, and of course that the exit is made clear. And for aviation, it's also really important that we have a sector deal to support the financial consequences and hold off any job losses in what's a very important part of our economy, and a very important part, by the way, for our recovery as well.
Face masks, it's been announced, is also going to be compulsory on public transport. I just wonder, because you were talking a little bit earlier about how MPs are in Westminster and not always socially distancing. Do you think it should be compulsory for MPs to have face masks?
Well, where we're going to move to is to say, and actually the World Health Organization have renewed their guidance only a couple of days ago to say, if you're in an environment, public transport or the workplace, where you can't maintain social distancing, then a face covering will provide some degree of protection, not entirely protection, but a degree of protection. And so, I do think we need to review the way that Parliament works. I mean, the frustration with Parliament, of course, is if it's at all avoidable, then it should be avoided. And we can vote electronically, we can vote in 15 seconds, we don't have to be queuing up for 40 minutes. Aside from it being unsafe, in my view, it's also a massively inefficient way of working.
So should MPs wear face coverings then, do you think, in the current situation?
Well, I'll be coming down on Monday from the northwest, where, of course, the R rate is a huge concern for people here, down to London. And I think the question is, well, why wait? If face coverings are now required to keep people safe on public transport, why wait a week? Am I more or less of a risk this Monday than I'll be the following Monday? And so I'm going to do what I believe is the right thing, which is to wear a face covering on public transport.
OK, and just finally, this week, Jeremy Corbyn questioned the impartiality of the Equality and Human Rights Commission that's conducting this inquiry into the party's handling of anti-Semitism claims. He said it was part of the government machine. Do you agree with Mr Corbyn's assessment, and do you think that's going to help the party win back the trust of Jewish people?
I think the point is that the review is taking place. And we take that extremely seriously. But more than that, there's a commitment to make sure that its recommendations are implemented with sincerity and a commitment to make sure that we right the wrong where Jewish people don't feel that the Labour Party can be a party for them. And so we do need to show concerted action. And Keir Starmer has been absolutely clear about his commitment to that, and we'll make sure that we follow through on it.
So do you agree with Jeremy Corbyn, then, that the Equality and Human Rights Commission is part of the government machine?
Well, of course, it's related to government, but my view is it'll act with integrity. It will look at the evidence base, and it will provide, practical solutions about what we can do to repair the trust issue that we've got. It's only when you face up to these issues can you address them. Burying the head in the sand, ignoring them, pretending that they're not there, even though we wish they weren't there, I'm afraid just doesn't deal with it. And so, we've got to face up to the issue that we've got, and we've got to make sure that we put practical steps in place to rebuild that trust.
OK, Jim McMahon, thank you very much for being on the programme today. Thank you.